France, August 1944. The roads were a blur of dust, diesel, and exhaustion. Hundreds of trucks stretched to the horizon, each painted with a red circle and a white bar, the insignia of a new kind of weapon, the Red Ball Express. Engines roared day and night, their headlights blacked out, their drivers running on coffee and courage. The mission was simple: keep General Patton's Third Army moving as it raced toward the German border. But simple didn't mean easy. The Allied spearhead was running out of fuel. Tanks stood idle in the French countryside, their crews helpless as victory slipped through their fingers. German generals laughed at the Americans' overconfidence. They believed no army could advance faster than its supply lines, not through the wreckage of France. But they hadn't counted on this. A rolling artery of 6,000 trucks driven by young men barely out of training, racing against time, mud, and enemy fire. Each gallon of gasoline they delivered kept Patton's advance alive, and each mile they covered rewrote the rules of modern war. The Germans mocked America's logistics. In the coming weeks, they would learn that logistics was America's secret weapon. By the summer of 1944, the Allied armies were sweeping across France with a speed no one, not even their own commanders, had anticipated. After the success of the Normandy landings and the breakout from St. Lo, German defenses collapsed. American, British, and Canadian troops surged eastward, liberating towns faster than maps could be updated. But victory carried a hidden burden. Movement required fuel, and fuel was running out. Every tank, truck, and half-track in the Allied arsenal drank gasoline faster than supply ships could unload it. For General George S. Patton, whose armored columns drove deeper into France each day, the problem was existential. His tanks were unstoppable until they stopped for lack of fuel. By mid-August, his Third Army was advancing at an astonishing pace, sometimes 80 miles a day. But his supply lines stretched thin, vulnerable, and overworked. The French railways lay in ruins, bridges were destroyed, and every major port except Cherbourg was still in German hands. Even with the success of Operation Cobra, the Allies faced a paradox. Their victory had outrun their logistics. German intelligence noticed. In intercepted reports and diaries, Wehrmacht officers joked that the Americans were motorized only as long as their tanks are gassed. One general wrote with smug satisfaction, "Their speed will become their weakness. When the fuel ends, so will the war of movement." They didn't realize that. At that very moment, the Americans were preparing an answer unlike anything in military history. The Allied supply base at Normandy was nearly 400 miles behind the front lines by late August. Everything, fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts, had to travel by road over the same narrow, cratered French highways. Convoys clogged the countryside. Every bridge, every turn became a bottleneck. A single armored division required 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. The math was impossible, unless something radical was done. On August 25, 1944, General John C. H. Lee, head of the U.S. Services of Supply, authorized the creation of a continuous high-speed trucking route dedicated entirely to one task: keeping Patton's tanks alive. It would run from the beaches of Normandy to the forward depots near Chartres and beyond. Nearly 700 kilometers of constant movement. The operation's code name came from a railway term for express freight. Red Ball, the name fit perfectly. It wasn't just a route, it was a lifeline. Within days, the Red Ball Express began operation. What followed was one of the greatest logistical achievements in modern history. Over 6,000 vehicles, mostly GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, began hauling supplies 24 hours a day. Convoys were marked by a red circle symbol and traveled on two routes, one outbound with fuel and ammunition, the other inbound with empty trucks returning for more. The roads were restricted to Red Ball vehicles only. No civilian or unauthorized military traffic was allowed. The system worked like a mechanical heartbeat. Every 3 minutes, another convoy rolled out. Every 24 hours, more than 12,000 tons of supplies reached the front. The drivers, many of them African-American soldiers from segregated transportation units, faced exhaustion, rain, and constant threat of attack. They slept in their trucks, ate on the move, and drove with blackout lights through pitch-dark nights. Many were barely trained. Most had never been to France before, but they kept the wheels turning. To the German generals watching from across the lines, it made no sense. Their own supply convoys, limited by fuel and Allied air superiority, barely moved during daylight. Yet somehow the Americans seemed able to feed an entire mechanized army across a continent. The Red Ball Express turned logistics into a weapon. It erased the limits of distance and turned fuel, the lifeblood of modern war, into a strategic advantage. Every tank that advanced, every aircraft that flew a mission, every artillery gun that fired depended on those rolling convoys. Without them, Patton's army would have stalled in the fields of France. As one U.S. officer wrote at the time, "We were not fighting the Germans, we were fighting the distance to Berlin." And the Red Ball Express was winning that fight. By September, Patton's Third Army had reached the Moselle River. Its advance was so fast that even Eisenhower's staff struggled to keep pace. The Germans no longer mocked the Americans' logistics. They feared them. What had begun as an improvisation became the backbone of Allied power in Europe. It was proof that America's true strength wasn't just in weapons or manpower, it was in motion. The Red Ball Express began as an emergency measure, a desperate gamble to keep the Allied advance from collapsing. But within weeks, it had evolved into a living organism, a pulsing network of men, machines, and momentum that moved with mechanical precision across the shattered heart of France. Every mile of road became part of a grand artery connecting the beaches of Normandy to the battlefronts of Lorraine. And every gallon of fuel it delivered carried the same message to Berlin. America had learned how to turn motion into power. For generations, European armies had fought within the limits of geography. Logistics was slow, rigid, predictable. Armies advanced as fast as their wagons or railways could follow. The U.S. Army broke that rule. The Red Ball Express turned logistics into a mobile supply network, capable of adjusting routes daily based on the speed of the front. Convoy headquarters monitored fuel, weather, and road conditions hour by hour. Bridges were reinforced, signs repainted, and French civilians drafted to keep the routes clear. What had once taken weeks by rail now took hours by truck. By early September 1944, more than 75% of all supplies for the Allied armies in northern France came from the Red Ball Express. It was a logistical miracle, one that even the Germans, masters of efficiency, couldn't comprehend. In late August, German reconnaissance planes began photographing the endless streams of American trucks snaking through the countryside. At first, intelligence officers assumed it was a retreat. No sane army could afford to move so many vehicles in broad daylight without fear of air attack. But as the days passed, their disbelief turned to alarm. They realized the Americans weren't retreating. They were feeding something larger than any army Europe had ever seen. One captured German colonel described it bluntly. "We did not believe their logistics were real until we saw it ourselves, and then we knew the war was lost." The Luftwaffe attempted air raids on the supply routes, but by 1944, German air power was a shadow of its former self. Most attacks failed to slow the convoys. The trucks simply detoured, reformed, and kept moving. For German generals used to measured efficiency, the sheer chaos of the Red Ball Express was incomprehensible. Yet somehow, it worked. They had underestimated a culture that valued improvisation over perfection. To them, the Americans were reckless. To the Americans, they were just being practical. The Red Ball Express was powered not only by engines but by endurance. The majority of its drivers, over 75%, were African American soldiers serving in segregated transportation units. Denied combat roles by racial policies, they now carried the burden of keeping the Allied armies alive. They drove up to 20 hours a day, through rain, mud, and enemy fire. They repaired their own trucks on the roadside, navigated bombed-out bridges, and slept in their seats. There were no rest days, no luxuries, only the road and the mission. Their courage went largely unrecognized during the war, but without them, Patton's army would have stopped in its tracks. As one driver, Private Luther Warren, recalled years later, "They told us to deliver, so we delivered. Didn't matter how tired, how scared, we kept the gas flowing." Every drum of fuel that reached the front lines carried not just gasoline, but human will. Patton understood better than anyone that speed was his greatest weapon, and his greatest risk. He drove his army hard, pushing his tanks deep into France even as fuel warnings flashed across his command posts. When supply lines faltered, He exploded in fury. When the Red Ball Express delivered, he praised them with genuine respect. "My men can eat their belts," Patton once said, "but my tanks have got to have gas." And gas they got, by the millions of gallons. In less than 3 months, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies, including 12 million gallons of fuel, 5 million rations, and 100,000 tons of ammunition. Each convoy ensured that the Third Army could keep driving, through France, into Luxembourg and toward the German border. As September turned to October, German generals began to understand the scale of what they were facing. Their own supply chains, crippled by Allied bombing and fuel shortages, could barely support static defense, let alone counterattack. Meanwhile, the Americans were sustaining a mechanized army across hundreds of miles of occupied territory. The old assumptions of warfare had collapsed. The Germans had once believed discipline and precision guaranteed victory, but the Americans had built a war machine that thrived on motion, flexibility, and overwhelming volume. In post-war interviews, captured German officers repeatedly cited one factor they hadn't accounted for. We could match their courage. We could match their tactics. We could not match their trucks. By autumn 1944, as Patton's tanks rolled toward the Moselle, the laughter in German headquarters had stopped. They no longer mocked the Americans' crude methods, because those methods were unstoppable. The Red Ball Express had done more than fuel an army. It had revealed the heart of America's strength, not in its weapons, but in its ability to move faster, farther, and longer than anyone else. And that realization, more than any defeat on the battlefield, broke the spirit of German high command. By the time the Red Ball Express reached full operation in early September 1944, it had already become the backbone of the Allied advance, a miracle of motion that turned gasoline into victory. To the German generals who had mocked American logistics, it was a revelation, an army that could create a moving city of trucks, drivers, and supply depots across an entire continent. But behind the thundering convoys and roaring engines lay a story far larger than any roadmap could show. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply route, it was a reflection of America itself, improvisational, relentless, and powered by human will. The Red Ball Express was a feat of organization that rivaled any combat operation. At its peak, more than 23,000 soldiers and 6,000 trucks operated simultaneously, moving in synchronized convoys from Normandy's beaches to the front lines beyond Paris. Each route had its own strict rhythm. Convoys left at fixed intervals, headlights covered, radios silent. Signs marked with red circles guided them along restricted roads, one direction for loaded trucks, another for the empties returning. Traffic control was managed by military police units who worked around the clock, rerouting convoys around craters, destroyed bridges and wrecked vehicles. Every day, more than 5,000 tons of fuel and ammunition reached the front, an unbroken stream of supply that made modern warfare possible. American logistics officers designed it like an assembly line. Maintenance depots, rest stations, and fueling points were positioned every 50 miles. If a truck broke down, it was pushed aside. Repaired later, the convoy never stopped. The result was a self-sustaining ecosystem of motion, a machine that fed itself through discipline, improvisation, and sheer willpower. As one colonel wrote in his field diary, "We didn't move supplies. We moved the war itself." The soul of the Red Ball Express wasn't its trucks. It was its drivers. Most were young. Many were African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, denied combat but tasked with the most dangerous work behind enemy lines. They drove overloaded vehicles through bombed-out villages, over narrow bridges, and down roads lined with wreckage and the stench of war. They were under constant pressure, from exhaustion, enemy ambushes, and mechanical failure. They navigated without headlights, guided only by moonlight and the glow of cigarettes in the dark. And yet they kept going. For weeks at a time, drivers slept in their seats, surviving on black coffee, K rations, and adrenaline. One driver, Private William Boyd, later recalled, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We were just trying to keep Patton from running out of gas." They called themselves the night riders and invisible soldiers of the supply line. In total, they moved more material than any mechanized force in history up to that point. The Germans had aces in the sky and tigers on the ground. The Americans had truck drivers with nerves of steel. Every convoy that thundered across France represented the full weight of American industry. Behind those trucks lay factories in Detroit, Toledo, and Chicago, running day and night to produce spare parts, tires, engines, and fuel drums. The Red Ball Express was more than a battlefield innovation. It was a direct extension of the arsenal of democracy. Where German production was shrinking under Allied bombing, American output was accelerating. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced over 600,000 trucks, 17 million tons of fuel, and 40 billion rounds of ammunition. The scale defied comprehension. German logistics officers, used to rationing oil and spare parts, were stunned when they captured abandoned American vehicles, each carrying more equipment than a German supply unit could manage in a week. To them, it seemed like waste. To the Americans, it was strategy. The U.S. had realized that in modern warfare, the ability to replace was more powerful than the ability to preserve. A broken truck was discarded, a damaged bridge rebuilt overnight. That flexibility, born from abundance, was what the German army could never replicate. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a logistical miracle, it was a tactical revolution. Every mile of gasoline it delivered translated directly into mobility for General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton understood speed like no one else. He treated logistics as his second battlefield, pushing his supply officers as hard as his tank crews. The Red Ball Express gave him exactly what he needed: fuel without delay, momentum without pause. As his divisions crossed France, they left German units reeling. The Wehrmacht's lines of retreat collapsed under the sheer pace of the American advance. Towns that had expected to hold out for weeks fell in hours. Captured German reports described Patton's tactics as madness made real. They couldn't believe how fast his columns moved, how quickly he regrouped, how effortlessly his tanks reappeared after each battle. What they didn't know was that his tanks were never far from a new shipment of fuel, ammunition, and rations, were all delivered by the Red Ball Express. It was the invisible weapon behind every visible victory. In the first days of the Allied breakout, German commanders had mocked the Americans' dependence on machines. To them, no army so reliant on gasoline could fight a sustained campaign. They imagined Patton's advance would grind to a halt once his tanks ran dry. But when the Red Ball Express came to life, their confidence vanished. They saw convoys stretching to the horizon, moving faster than their intelligence reports could track. Fuel dumps exploded under Allied air raids, yet the Americans never seemed to slow down. When German scouts observed the constant stream of trucks, they reported in disbelief. The Americans move as if the roads belonged to them. And in truth, they did. The Red Ball Express turned every French road into an artery of war, one that no German general could sever. Their mockery had turned to dread. Their predictions of American collapse had become the story of their own defeat. The Red Ball Express had proven that logistics wasn't just a support function. It was a weapon, one that could move faster than fear and hit harder than steel. What Germany had dismissed as excess was now rewriting the laws of modern warfare. As the Red Ball Express thundered across France, it didn't just supply Patton's tanks, it supplied an idea. For the first time in history, logistics itself had become the decisive weapon of war. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't fire bullets or drop bombs. But without it, no victory was possible. To the German generals watching from afar, the lesson was as shocking as it was humiliating. They had spent decades perfecting tactics. The Americans had perfected motion. The heart of the Red Ball Express wasn't a general or a command center. It was the GMC CCKW-2 1-2-ton truck, known simply as the Deuce and a Half. It was the unsung hero of the European war, built in staggering numbers, more than 800,000 units by 1945. The truck became the blood vessel of Allied logistics. Its design was simple, rugged, and forgiving. It could carry 3 tons of cargo, ford rivers, and keep moving with bullet holes in its body. Its parts were standardized across models, meaning repairs could be made anywhere, often in minutes. German supply units, accustomed to vehicles that required specialized mechanics, couldn't comprehend how the Americans kept thousands of trucks running nonstop. The answer was built into every nut and bolt: standardization. A broken truck was never a crisis. The part was swapped, the vehicle pushed back into the line, and the convoy rolled on. The Germans called this wasteful efficiency. To the Americans, it was strategic pragmatism, the understanding that speed mattered more than perfection. Behind the roar of the engine stood the calm, measured leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He understood something that eluded many European commanders, that logistics was strategy. When his generals argued about tactics, Eisenhower thought about roads, bridges, fuel depots, and trucks. He didn't win battles by accident. He won them by planning for movement. In his post-war reflections, Eisenhower wrote, "Amateurs talk strategy. Professionals talk logistics." The Red Ball Express was proof of that philosophy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was decisive. Eisenhower's genius wasn't in the dramatic gesture, but in the quiet orchestration of an empire of motion, a symphony of fuel, manpower, and machinery. To the German High Command, obsessed with battlefield brilliance, this was incomprehensible. Their war was built around individual genius, Rommel in Africa, Guderian in Poland, Model in the East. Eisenhower's war was built around a system and systems. Unlike heroes don't tire or die. For years, the Wehrmacht had believed it held a monopoly on discipline and efficiency. Its officers viewed American soldiers as brash, inexperienced, and dependent on comfort. The Red Ball Express shattered that illusion. When captured German officers were shown the scale of American supply routes after the war, they were stunned. To them, this was not military order. It was chaos with purpose. And yet it worked better than their most rigid systems. One German colonel, after examining Red Ball logistics charts in 1945, confessed, "We never imagined the Americans could make war like this. It was not our way. It was beyond our understanding." That was the psychological shift, the realization that industrial democracy could outthink, outbuild, and outlast authoritarian precision. The Red Ball Express didn't just deliver fuel, it delivered humility. The moment Germany saw that efficiency alone could not defeat adaptability. The Red Ball Express was also a story of quiet heroism, of men who worked without glory. While fighter aces and tank commanders filled newspapers, the drivers of the Red Ball Express went largely unrecognized. Most were black soldiers, serving in segregated units under white officers. They faced discrimination off the battlefield, but on the road they carried the war on their shoulders. They were attacked by enemy aircraft, shelled by artillery, and haunted by fatigue. Yet they never stopped driving. Each barrel of fuel they delivered was another victory against both fascism abroad and prejudice at home. Decades later, veterans of the Red Ball Express would speak not with bitterness, but with pride. They knew they had kept history in motion. As Sergeant James Payne recalled, "We weren't fighting for medals. We were fighting to keep the line alive." Their contribution would later be recognized as one of the most vital in the Allied war effort, the unseen foundation of victory. By autumn 1944, the Wehrmacht had lost more than ground. It had lost comprehension. German logistics had collapsed. Railroads shattered, fuel depots bombed, and supply chains strangled. Yet the Americans kept moving. When Allied troops captured German supply officers, they asked how the Reich intended to fight without oil or transport. One officer reportedly replied, "We planned on you stopping, but you didn't stop." That single sentence captured the difference between the two systems. The Germans relied on planning. The Americans relied on momentum. In the months that followed, as the Red Ball Express evolved into new operations supplying the push into Germany, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The laughter that had once echoed in German command rooms was gone. The myth of American weakness had been buried under 1,000 tons of gasoline. The Red Ball Express had transformed not just warfare, but perception itself. It proved that America's real strength wasn't in its tanks or its planes. It was in its ability to turn ordinary people and machines into an unstoppable flow of power. When the convoys finally slowed in late 1944, replaced by captured railways and forward depots, the lesson they left behind was eternal. Wars are not won by those who fight the best, but by those who move the fastest and never stop. By September 1944, The Red Ball Express had become the heartbeat of the Allied advance, but even the strongest heart can only beat so fast. The system that had once seemed unstoppable was now being stretched to its limits. The roads of France were choked with trucks. Engines overheated, tires burst, and bridges collapsed under the weight of endless convoys. Yet the demands of the front kept growing. Patton's Third Army was burning through 400,000 gallons of fuel a day, and Eisenhower's staff feared the entire Allied offensive might stall. The miracle of motion that had powered victory was now on the edge of exhaustion. The Red Ball Express had been designed as a temporary measure, an emergency bridge until captured ports and railways could take over. But as the Allied armies drove deeper into Europe, the convoy system had to cover ever longer distances, across roads that were never meant for such traffic. Trucks wore out faster than they could be replaced. Drivers worked 18-hour shifts, sometimes longer. The maintenance crews could barely keep up. Engines were running without oil changes, and transmissions failed by the hundreds. In some sectors, convoys were moving barely 10 miles an hour, crawling through mud and wreckage. Every delay rippled through the front lines like a pulse of panic. For the first time, the Red Ball Express was faltering. German commanders sensed the strain. They knew that if the Americans slowed down, even for a few days, the Wehrmacht could regroup, reinforce, and perhaps launch a counterattack. But the Americans refused to stop. One officer summed it up bluntly: "If the trucks quit, we lose the war. So the trucks won't quit." The pressure reached its peak during the drive toward the Moselle River and the German border in late September. Patton's tanks were within striking distance of Germany itself, but without fuel they were helpless. He sent frantic messages to headquarters demanding gasoline. Supply officers begged for time, but there was none to give. Every drum of fuel arriving from Normandy was already spoken for before it even left the depot. To make matters worse, heavy rains turned the supply roads into rivers of mud. Trucks bogged down for miles, their engines sputtering as drivers fought to keep momentum. Convoys were ambushed by desperate German patrols, who struck the supply lines knowing they were the artery of the Allied war machine. One attack near Chartres destroyed 20 trucks and killed several drivers. The survivors simply cleared the wreckage and kept moving. There was no other choice. By early October, the situation was critical. Patton's tanks had advanced so far that even the Red Ball Express could barely reach them. Fuel reserves dropped to hours. Then, in one of the most daring acts of improvisation of the entire campaign, U.S. logistics officers reorganized the entire route overnight. They extended the convoy network deeper into liberated France, commandeering every usable vehicle. Jeep trailers, ambulances, even captured German trucks were loaded with fuel and sent forward. The Red Ball Express adapted and endured. The strain of supply soon became a battle of wills between commanders. Patton wanted more fuel to continue his blitz toward the Rhine. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British forces in the north, demanded priority for his own operation. Market Garden Eisenhower had to choose. He divided the supplies, keeping both offensives alive but neither fully fueled. The decision caused frustration, but it also revealed something larger. The Red Ball Express had become too successful for its own good. It had created the illusion that American logistics were infinite. They weren't. Fuel depots in Normandy were nearly empty. Trucks were wearing out faster than replacements could arrive. Even the drivers, hardened by months of work, were collapsing from exhaustion. One quartermaster described it like trying to refuel a hurricane. Yet even in chaos, the system held together, a living network of men and machines refusing to stop. To the Germans, this struggle was invisible. From their perspective, the Americans seemed unstoppable. Every time a counterattack formed, another wave of trucks arrived, feeding the Allied front like a tide that would not recede. German field reports from the West Wall, Siegfried Line, described it with awe and dread. Their supply never ceases. We destroy their bridges, and by the next day they are driving again. Another officer wrote bitterly, "They fight with gasoline the way we once fought with courage." In reality, the Red Ball Express was running on courage of its own, the courage of tired men driving through nights that never ended, under skies that never stayed quiet. By October, the convoys had covered over 10 million miles, hauling more than 400,000 tons of supplies. The drivers were covered in dust, mud, and sweat. But they had accomplished the impossible. They had kept an entire army in motion for 3 months without pause. One reporter who rode with the convoys wrote, "They called them truck drivers. They were more than that. They were soldiers of movement, and they never stopped moving." It was true. No medals, no parades, just the unending grind of diesel engines in the dark. The Red Ball Express had crossed from logistics into legend. In late October 1944, as the first Allied supply trains began to roll on repaired French railways, the Red Ball Express started to wind down. But its mission was complete. Patton's army had reached the threshold of Germany. The fuel had arrived. The front had held. And the laughter of German generals, once loud and confident, had vanished. They had learned a final, humbling truth. The Americans had turned the most boring part of war, supply, into a weapon that could not be defeated. The Red Ball Express had done more than fuel an army. It had fueled history. By the end of October 1944, the Red Ball Express was no longer an experiment. It was the beating heart of an empire on the move. For nearly 3 relentless months, the convoys had run day and night, crossing the face of France like an iron river. But now the men who had kept it alive were running on fumes, much like the machines they drove. The Allied armies had reached the borders of Germany. Patton's tanks were lined along the Moselle and Saar rivers, staring east toward the Siegfried Line. They had crossed half a continent at a speed no military force had ever matched, and every mile of that advance had been carried on the backs of truck drivers who refused to stop. In the early weeks of November, Eisenhower ordered a new offensive to breach the German border before winter set in. Patton's Third Army prepared to strike. But once again, the question of fuel loomed like a storm on the horizon. The Red Ball Express had already moved more than 412,000 tons of supplies, yet the front demanded more every day. Trucks ran continuously from Normandy to forward depots in Nancy, Verdun, and Metz. Every driver knew that each gallon delivered meant another step toward Germany's defeat. The weather turned brutal. Cold rain turned roads to sludge. Engines froze in the night, brakes failed on icy slopes. Convoy commanders fought to keep morale alive as exhaustion set in. Still, they drove on. No one wanted to be the driver who failed to deliver Patton's fuel. In one convoy report dated November 5, 1944, an officer wrote, "We are at the edge of endurance, but the tanks must move, and so we move." As Patton's army approached the fortress city of Metz, the Red Ball Express became the deciding factor in one of the hardest-fought battles of the Western Front. Metz, heavily fortified and surrounded by rivers, was thought to be impregnable. The Germans believed the Americans would halt for winter. Instead, Patton attacked. And behind him came the convoys, thousands of trucks threading through fog and artillery fire to keep the assault supplied. It was a logistical nightmare, narrow roads, collapsing bridges, and constant ambushes. But the Express endured. Every bridge destroyed by German retreating forces was rebuilt within 48 hours. Every stalled truck was replaced within minutes. The chain never broke. When Metz finally fell in late November, the victory was not only military, it was mechanical. For every tank shell that struck a target, a dozen Red Ball drivers had made it possible. Even German prisoners admitted their disbelief. One captured officer told interrogators, "We expected your army to stop for lack of supplies. We never imagined you could feed it like this." The Red Ball Express had succeeded beyond imagination, but at a cost few understood. Thousands of drivers were injured or killed in accidents and ambushes. Exhaustion caused as many casualties as enemy fire. Mechanics worked by lantern light, repairing engines that had run for weeks without rest. Medical officers treated drivers for fatigue-induced hallucinations, men swerving at shadows on the road, convinced they saw aircraft or mines that weren't there. And yet, morale remained unbroken. For many drivers, especially the African-American soldiers who formed its backbone, this was their war, their contribution, their chance to prove what courage looked like when no one was watching. Private Henry Red Williams, who drove from Normandy to Verdun and back more than 30 times, later said, "We didn't win medals. We won miles." That was enough. While the Americans were perfecting motion, Germany was running out of it. Fuel shortages paralyzed entire divisions. Tanks were abandoned, aircraft grounded. The once feared blitzkrieg, built on speed, had become a crawl. When the Allies captured German vehicles during the advance, many were found with engines intact but fuel tanks dry. In one of his final reports to Berlin, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt lamented, "We have the machines but not the means to move them." That was the cruel inversion of 1940. 4 years earlier, Germany had raced across Europe while its enemies lagged behind. Now the roles were reversed. The Red Ball Express had given the Americans what the Germans had once claimed as their own: total, unbroken mobility. By mid-November 1944, as new ports opened at Antwerp and Le Havre and railways came back online, the Red Ball Express began to slow. The trucks that had carried the war across France were finally allowed to rest. Engines cooled, tires wore down, drivers exhaled. Officially, the Red Ball Express was shut down on November 16, 1944. In just 82 days, it had carried enough fuel and ammunition to sustain 3 entire field armies and helped liberate most of Western Europe. General Eisenhower later called it one of the most vital undertakings of the war. Patton, never one for understatement, said it even more bluntly. "My tanks could not have fought their way out of Normandy without the Red Ball boys." For the German generals who had once mocked American logistics, those words stung more than any defeat, because they understood now that they hadn't been beaten by strategy or firepower. They had been beaten by organization, by movement, by improvisation on an industrial scale. In post-war interrogations, captured German staff officers often spoke of a single moment when they realized the war was unwinnable. It wasn't D-Day. It wasn't Stalingrad. It was when they saw, with their own eyes, the endless streams of American trucks rolling eastward, headlights off, engines growling, carrying enough fuel to feed an entire army. One officer described it as the sound of inevitability. That was the true climax of the Red Ball Express. Not the noise of victory, but the silence of realization. Germany had been outthought, outbuilt, and outmoved. When the last Red Ball truck returned to Normandy, its driver painted 3 words across the tailgate: "We kept rolling." It was more than a slogan. It was a summary of an entire war. Because while the Germans had laughed at American logistics, it was those same logistics that drove across Europe and straight into history. When the Red Ball Express officially ended on November 16, 1944, it left behind more than miles of worn-out roads and burnt engines. It left a legacy of endurance and transformation. In just 82 days, it had done the impossible. Across 700 miles of shattered French countryside, its convoys had delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies, the lifeblood of the Allied armies that liberated Europe. To Eisenhower's staff, it was proof that industrial democracy could fight and win a war of motion. To the men who drove the trucks, it was proof that grit could carry history forward, even when machines could go no further. The end of the Red Ball Express didn't bring rest. Most of its trucks and drivers were immediately folded into new supply operations, the Green Diamond and White Ball routes, feeding the Allied advance through Belgium and into the German heartland. But the name Red Ball stayed. It became a legend, shorthand for the unstoppable energy that had fueled victory. The Red Ball Express fundamentally changed how armies thought about warfare. Before 1944, logistics had been seen as the dull background to glory, a necessary but uninspired task behind the front lines. After the Express, that perception vanished forever. Eisenhower called it the war behind the war. Historians later described it as the prototype for modern mechanized logistics, a concept that would define every U.S. campaign, from Korea to Iraq. The U.S. Army's post-war manuals began citing the Red Ball Express as a case study in improvisation and adaptability. It proved that victory in a global war didn't belong to the nation with the best tactics, but to the one that could deliver what its soldiers needed, when they needed it wherever they were. German generals, who once derided American machine thinking, later admitted that they had been outmaneuvered not by superior weapons, but by superior organization. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring reportedly remarked in 1946, "The Americans did not fight a war of battles. They fought a war of movement, and their supply system made it possible." That was the final humiliation. to realize that the greatest military machine of the 20th century had been defeated not by strategy, but by logistics. For the men who had driven the convoys, the end of the express brought a strange silence. The constant roar of engines, the endless motion, suddenly it was gone. They had been part of something vast and anonymous, and now they scattered across Europe to new assignments or the long road home. Among them were thousands of African American soldiers whose contribution had gone largely unrecognized during the war. They had carried more than fuel. They had carried dignity through a segregated army that gave them little of it. In later years, veterans like Sergeant Edgar O. Chapman and Corporal Eddie Perkins would speak of their pride not in medals, but in the mission itself. "We proved that we could carry the fight, not with guns, but with grit," Chapman said in a 1982 interview. It would take decades for official recognition to come. In 1992, the U.S. Army finally honored the Red Ball Express with a formal tribute at Fort Eustis, Virginia. By then, only a handful of veterans remained, old men remembering the nights they spent on roads no map had ever marked. But the emotion was the same as it had been in 1944, quiet, humble, proud. When the Red Ball Express stopped, the war didn't end, but the balance had permanently shifted. Germany's last hope, the Ardennes offensive that December, was doomed before it began. The U.S. logistical machine, refined, tested, and unstoppable, could now deliver entire armies faster than the Wehrmacht could deploy a division. In that sense, the Red Ball Express wasn't just a logistical success. It was the moment when industrial democracy proved its ultimate strength, not in destruction, but in persistence. The German High Command had once laughed at America's obsession with production and quantity. Now, as their tanks ran dry and their soldiers went hungry, they understood the cost of that arrogance. They had mocked the idea that mass could overcome mastery. In the end, mass, organized, mobile, and relentless mass, had crushed them. The Red Ball Express had turned America's factories into frontline weapons and its drivers into heroes of endurance. It had changed the very meaning of power in modern war. By the time the last Red Ball truck returned to Normandy, the war had changed, and so had the men who drove it. They were no longer anonymous mechanics and drivers. They were veterans of the most intense logistical operation in modern history. Many of them had never seen combat in the traditional sense, yet few had lived further from safety. When they stepped down from their trucks for the final time, they carried with them the invisible scars of fatigue and fear. They had faced ambushes, driven through artillery zones, and seen comrades lost not in battle, but in the long, merciless grind of the road. Still, most spoke of pride, not pain. They had seen the war's hidden front, and they knew that victory had depended on it. After the war, the lessons of the Red Ball Express reshaped both American and Allied military planning. The concept of mobile supply networks became standard doctrine. Armies now trained not only to fight but to sustain motion, to think like logisticians as much as tacticians. In Korea, Vietnam, and later in Iraq and Afghanistan, the blueprint of the Red Ball Express was visible in every convoy and forward base. Its DNA was embedded in the way the U.S. military moved, but perhaps its greatest legacy lay outside the battlefield. Many of the soldiers who had driven its trucks returned home to build new lives, becoming mechanics, engineers, and truckers who helped power post-war America. The highways they later drove in peacetime were, in a sense, the descendants of those French roads they once conquered by endurance. For decades, the Red Ball Express remained a footnote in war history, overshadowed by the great battles of Normandy, the Bulge, and Berlin. Yet without it, those victories might never have come. In the 1950s, the story was briefly revived in a Hollywood film, but the reality had been grittier than anything on screen. The men of the Express weren't actors or heroes by choice. They were soldiers who worked without pause, under orders that could not be disobeyed. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began to recognize the Red Ball Express for what it truly was, a turning point in the history of warfare. Documentaries, veteran reunions, and museum exhibits began to tell their story in full. The dust, the danger, the sleepless nights, and the quiet pride of men who had kept the war alive mile by mile. At the U.S. Army Transportation Museum in Virginia, a restored GMC CCKW truck stands as a memorial to their work. On its side, in white paint, are the words once seen on the roads of France. Red ball route. Keep 'em rolling. Every visitor who walks past it sees more than a machine. They see the endurance of ordinary soldiers who turned motion into victory. In post-war Germany, the story of the Red Ball Express became part of a broader reckoning. Former Wehrmacht officers admitted that their understanding of warfare had been too narrow, too obsessed with front lines and heroics. They had ignored the power of logistics, the war of movement that America had mastered. Captured diaries and reports reveal their astonishment even months after the Express had ended. One officer wrote, "We fought men. They fought with machines, and the machines did not stop." That sentence became a symbol of the new reality. The old age of glory and command had given way to the modern age of systems and supply. And in that transformation, the Red Ball Express stood as the turning point. The moment the world learned that victory belonged to those who could keep moving longest. In the decades since the war, the Red Ball Express has come to represent more than logistics. It stands for resilience, for the ability to endure, adapt, and persist against exhaustion and doubt. For the men who drove it, it was a chapter written not in blood but in oil, sweat, and dust. For the nation that built it, it was proof that democracy could organize chaos and turn it into victory. Today, when modern military planners speak of sustainment and supply chains and logistical superiority, they are, knowingly or not, echoing the lessons first learned. On those French roads in 1944, the Red Ball Express may have stopped, rolling long ago, but the principle it proved has never stopped moving. As the engines fell silent and the roads of war grew empty, the men of the Red Ball Express left behind a truth that endures. In modern war, movement is victory, and those who can keep moving will always win. There are moments in history when power isn't measured in guns or generals, but in motion. The Red Ball Express was one of those moments. It wasn't a weapon, a battle, or a victory parade. It was a flow, a ceaseless current of engines, courage, and faith in the idea that persistence itself could conquer impossibility. In those 82 days of 1944, America proved that victory in the modern world would not belong to those who shouted the loudest or fought the fiercest. It would belong to those who could move, faster, farther, longer than anyone else. The German generals had once laughed at the notion that trucks could win a war. They stopped laughing when those same trucks crossed France and reached their borders. They learned that the true battlefield stretched far beyond the front, into the factories, the fuel depots, and the minds of the people who refused to stop working. For the men who drove the Red Ball Express, the war was measured not in battles but in miles, and every mile carried a story of endurance over exhaustion, of teamwork over chaos, of ordinary soldiers proving that history is not written only by those who fight, but also by those who make the fighting possible. When the last convoy rolled to a stop, the world had changed. Logistics was no longer invisible. It had become the heartbeat of modern power. The Red Ball Express showed that America's greatest strength was not just its machines or its might, but its ability to organize hope into motion. And in that motion lay the future of warfare, and perhaps the future of civilization itself.